The four-bedroom colonial stands as a silent monument to a success that no longer exists. Inside, the air is heavy, thick with the unsaid realization that David and Sarah are mathematically terminal. They didn't blow their life savings at a casino or fall victim to a sudden economic crash. In fact, their financial autopsy reveals the exact opposite. They did everything society told them to do. Yet, 24 months after the biggest victory of their lives, they are insolvent, trapped in a pristine 3,500 square foot solitary confinement. It began with the intoxicating glow of a Tuesday afternoon email, a 40% surge in base salary, a life-changing influx of capital that instantly rewrote their trajectory. In that split second of euphoria, the money ceased to be math. It became pure dopamine. Empowered by this new income, they followed the traditional script with surgical precision, immediately exchanging their liquid cash flow for heavy liabilities masquerading as assets. They saw a horizon of freedom, oblivious to the structural snare being set by their own hands. They upgraded to the quiet cul-de-sac and parked a $75,000 European SUV in the garage. Smiling as they signed the $650,000 mortgage, they genuinely believed they were building generational wealth. In reality, they were legally notarizing their own slow suffocation. Their new property ceased to be a shelter and mutated into a meticulous, breathing parasite, draining the oxygen from their checking accounts every single night at 3 a.m. Every hidden maintenance invoice and property tax hike tightened the grip millimeter by agonizing millimeter. Their fixed cost ratio spiked from a healthy 55% to a lethal 87% of their net take-home pay. The math was cold and final. David and Sarah had designed a life that demanded absolute perfection just to remain upright. They had successfully pumped the oxygen out of their own room, leaving no margin for the inevitable friction of reality. Now their liquid reserves have vanished, leaving them defenseless. They are standing on a glass floor, watching the first hairline cracks spiderweb beneath their feet. The facade is still standing, but the foundation is gone. How does a corporate promotion systematically dismantle a family from the inside out? To understand this collapse, we must first dissect the invisible poison of lifestyle inflation. Their margin for error is exactly zero.
Welcome to the Financial Autopsy. We do not judge, we dissect. We operate under one clinical truth. Money is a magnifier, not a cure. Financial ruin is rarely a sudden accident. It is usually a structural self-destruction. Today, we open the file on an anomaly, a case where the American dream was weaponized against its owners. David and Sarah's collapse was not triggered by a loss of income, but by the devastating psychology of new wealth and the invisible math of lifestyle inflation. Their financial records reveal how a family can sink under the weight of its own success. Moving from the crime scene to the precinct desk, we focus on cold, hard data and the structural rot hidden beneath the pristine facade. If you wish to validate this evidence, like, and request permanent clearance to the autopsy room, subscribe. Authorize your credentials below. It is time to examine the numbers hidden beneath the floorboards. Let's begin. Before the email, David and Sarah were mathematically solvent, living in a modest townhouse with a combined gross income of $120,000. Their fixed costs accounted for a healthy 55% of their net take-home pay, allowing for a consistent 20% savings rate. They had margins. They had breathing room. Then came the promotion. Overnight, their household gross income spiked to $168,000. It was a statistical triumph, but sudden capital does not just change bank balances, it alters cognitive function. It creates a dangerous illusion of invincibility. The pathology of lifestyle inflation never presents itself as recklessness, it disguises itself as a hard-earned reward. They didn't view their new $48,000 raise as a defensive shield against future risk. They viewed it as a mandate to expand. Society had promised them a specific aesthetic for reaching this executive bracket, and they felt an overwhelming psychological drive to claim it. They weren't being greedy, they were executing the standard cultural blueprint. The first structural compromise was the primary residence. Their townhouse suddenly felt inadequate, a cramped relic of their previous tax bracket. They listed it, took their equity, and signed the papers for a $650,000 four-bedroom colonial. They deployed their liquid reserves for the down payment. trading their survival buffer for vaulted ceilings. On paper, it looked like a traditional investment, but the move immediately pushed their housing costs past the conservative 28% of gross income guideline, draining the oxygen from their future. The danger of the mortgage industry is that it calculates lending based on maximum mathematical capacity, not maximum operational safety. The underwriter analyzed their new gross income and pre-approved them for the absolute ceiling of their borrowing power. David and Sarah made a fatal assumption. They believed that if the bank approved the loan, the math was inherently safe. They deferred their risk management to an institution designed to monetize their debt. By the time the ink dried, their pristine new shelter had already begun its transition from a long-term investment into a lethal cash flow liability. But a premium asset demands a premium ecosystem. The driveway of a pristine colonial creates visual dissonance when occupied by aging, depreciating sedans. Within 60 days, the psychological pressure forced another upgrade, a $75,000 European luxury SUV. The rationalization was clinical, safety, and professional prestige. But the combined costs of the loan and insurance premiums pushed their debt-to-income ratio beyond prudent underwriting levels. Another signature in black ink. They were parking a liability in a climate-controlled tomb.
Then came the internal vacuum of the property itself. A larger architectural footprint requires massive capital to fill it, and their modest furniture looked cheap inside the vaulted spaces. Systematically, they furnished the void. Premium sectionals, a massive hardwood dining table, and ambient lighting. They spent $25,000 on credit cards in 4 months. None of these were catastrophic alone, but together they formed a steady, silent drain of their remaining liquidity. They were buying the perfect life, and that life was beginning to bleed them dry.
6 months post-promotion, they hosted the mandatory housewarming dinner, the absolute peak of the facade. The ambient lighting illuminated the custom furniture as friends walked through the hallways, offering the social validation David and Sarah craved. They stood in their designer kitchen, clinking glasses and looking like the pinnacle of victory. To the outside world, they had won the game, but as the guests departed and silence returned, the objective reality of their balance sheet remained. Their absolute fixed expenses had grown by over 70% in nominal dollar terms. Their fixed cost ratio had surged from a safe 55% to a lethal 87% of their net take-home pay. The 20% savings margin they once had was entirely erased. They had built a beautiful, massive machine, and now they were trapped inside it. The stage was set for the first crack to become a collapse.
18 months into their new lifestyle, the structural decay was absolute. Despite a gross income of $168,000, their checking account was a ghost town by the 14th of every month. Their 87% fixed cost ratio had entirely consumed their cash flow, leaving them with less than $2,000 in total liquid cash. To the forensic accountant, the diagnosis is undeniable. They were already structurally terminal. Then came a sweltering Tuesday in July. The primary HVAC unit suffered a catastrophic compressor failure. The invoice was $3,500. For an executive household, this should have been a minor inconvenience, but when your mathematical margin is zero, a routine repair becomes a terminal event. The HVAC unit was not the villain, it was the detective finally discovering the body behind the pristine walls. Pause the autopsy and examine the evidence. When was the point of no return? Leave your forensic diagnosis in the comments. Let's see who truly understands the math of ruin. The $3,500 HVAC invoice was a sum they simply did not possess. David took the path of least resistance, plastic. He swiped a credit card at 24% APR, a silent compromise he believed would be a temporary bridge. It felt like a minor adjustment, but in reality, it was the first domino in a cascading structural failure. The immediate consequence was an invisible spike in their monthly minimum payments, adding weight to an already overloaded system. In a cash flow perfectly consumed by the mortgage and the SUV, that extra $150 was the exact amount that pushed them from breaking even into a monthly deficit. They were now officially operating at a loss every 30 days just to maintain the appearance of their success. The machine they had built was demanding its first pound of flesh, and they were forced to liquidate their future to pay for their present aesthetic. Denial became their primary survival mechanism. David began intercepting the mail, hiding the growing stack of white envelopes in his designer briefcase. Sarah avoided looking at the banking app, convincing herself that if the lights were still on and the manicured lawn was green, the math was still working. They stopped talking about the future. Every conversation became a minefield of potential admissions. Their perfect life was now a shared lie, held together by silence and mounting interest. Within 90 days, the deficit compounded. When you operate with zero margin, the slightest headwind becomes a hurricane. A routine $400 car maintenance bill or an unexpected $250 medical copay now flowed directly onto the credit cards. They were no longer using debt to purchase luxury, they were using it to purchase basic survival inside a luxury shell. Every swipe felt like a physical weight, a millimeter of the grip tightening. By month 6, the balance on their high-interest cards had ballooned past $15,000.
The 24% interest was aggressively eating away at the principal, making progress impossible. Then the system noticed. The credit bureaus, operating without empathy, saw their utilization ratio spike past 80% and responded with clinical aggression. Their credit score plummeted by 60 points in a single quarter, a digital mark of their impending collapse. The lower credit score immediately infected their broader financial ecosystem. The very institutions that had financed their expansion were now quietly preparing to dismantle their access to capital. Their auto insurance provider ran a routine check and hiked their premiums by 15% due to the new risk profile. A secondary credit card company suddenly slashed their available limit, further damaging their utilization ratio and driving their score even lower. They were caught in an automated downward spiral. Desperation forced a moment of truth. They tried a cash-out refinance on the $650,000 Colonial, believing their home equity would be their salvation. But the banking algorithms had already closed the door. Because their debt-to-income ratio was in the red and their credit score was shattered, the bank coldly declined the application. The equity they had worked so hard to build was now trapped behind a wall of their own making. The psychological erosion was now visible. The vaulted ceilings that once felt like a triumph now felt like they were closing in. They fought bitterly over a $60 grocery bill, while a $75,000 SUV sat in the driveway. The dissonance was agonizing. They had followed every instruction the world gave them, yet they were suffocating in the dark. By the time they realized they were drowning, the system had already calculated their expiration.
2 years after the promotion, the 4-bedroom Colonial sits on the cul-de-sac, its lawn immaculate. But inside, the financial ecosystem has collapsed. David and Sarah are liquidating retirement accounts just to make minimum payments. They sleep in separate rooms, trapped in a 3,500 square foot solitary confinement. To the neighborhood, they are the pinnacle of success. To the forensic accountant, they are a closed case of structural insolvency. If you ask David and Sarah what destroyed them, they will point to the economy or the HVAC failure. But an autopsy relies strictly on structural evidence. The root cause is a behavioral pathology, the voluntary elimination of financial margin. They initiated their own collapse the moment they signed contracts that perfectly matched their new expenses to their new income. They mistook a temporary surge in capital for a permanent shift in reality. The fatal error was substituting institutional underwriting for personal risk management. The mortgage bank approved them up to a 36% debt-to-income ratio, an algorithmic limit designed for the bank's yield, not the borrower's solvency. By treating a structural ceiling as a baseline target, they assumed the math was safe. They outsourced their survival to a system engineered to consume them. They followed the map, but the map was a trap. This psychology created a dangerous illusion of permanent acceleration. They viewed a 40% salary increase not as a shield, but as the new permanent floor. They traded liquid capital for heavy, depreciating liabilities. Financial survival requires margin, the gap between rigid costs and liquid cash flow. When you compress that margin to 87% of net take-home pay, you design a structure that cannot absorb volatility. You build a life that requires absolute perfection to sustain itself. Without margin, you are defenseless against the inevitable friction of reality. David and Sarah did not collapse because they rebelled against the system. They collapsed because they followed its instructions with precision. They accepted the prevailing assumption that high income naturally neutralizes risk. But high income without structural discipline is just a larger target. They bought the life they were supposed to buy and locked themselves inside a beautiful, depreciating cage. The file on David and Sarah is closed. The pattern, however, repeats daily. Thousands of promotion emails will be opened tomorrow, and thousands of lethal contracts will be signed. The architecture of fragility is rebuilt every single morning. To request clearance and examine the next report so you can architect your own survival, enter the autopsy room below. The autopsy is concluded. Watching a structural collapse is a warning. Surviving one requires a blueprint. To protect your foundation from the exact traps we've discussed today, I have developed a proprietary 3-pillar framework called the F.A.R. system, designed for financial autopsy resilience. It is the exact architecture you need to immunize your wealth and move from victim to architect. You can access the full dossier by clicking the link in the description below or in the first pinned comment. Get the Financial Autopsy Report and secure your foundation. Let the storm come.